So enough about use state for now. Let's now send this to a web server so that we can also dive into some other hooks, for example, hooks that help us replace class lifecycle methods. For this, I'll again use Firebase as a dummy backend. We'll just create a new project here, React hooks update. You can name this whatever you want. Create this project here, and I'm just using Firebase here because I don't want to write any complex server-side logic. I just want to have a server we can talk to, which automatically has a database attached to it, so that the data also gets stored there. So let's wait for this to finish and then dive into this newly created project. And in there, go to database, and now make sure to set up a new database there, and don't use Firestore, but scroll down a bit and use the real-time database. Click on Create Database and start in test mode, which means that everyone is allowed to read and write. Because here we'll just use this as a dummy backend. This is the URL you can now send requests to store data in that database. And to send requests, we can use Axios, as we did in this course, or we use the built-in Fetch API, which is built right into JavaScript. It's totally up to you what you want to do. To mix things up, I'll use the Fetch API built into JavaScript. So when we're adding an ingredient, besides updating this locally, I also want to send an HTTP request. And I do this by calling fetch. And again, this is a function the browser understands. It's not a React function, not a React hooks function. It's a browser function, so to say. The fetch API, as it's called, is built into modern browsers. This will send a behind-the-scenes HTTP request. And fetch takes a URL you want to send the request to, which is a string. In our case, that's not just this URL, but let's say we want to store the ingredients in an ingredients node, and Firebase then also requires a .json at the end. That's just a Firebase thing, nothing to do with React, nothing to do with React hooks. So this is where we want to send our data to, and you gotta know that fetch by default will send a GET request. Firebase wants a POST request though, if we want to store data. Hence, we pass a second argument to fetch, and that's an object that allows us to configure this request. And on this object, we can set the method property to post. Default is get, and you never need to set that, but we want to set this to post. You then also can add a body property to define what you want to send. And that has to be JSON data, which means you can use JSON, which is another thing built into the browser. It's a class in the end built into browsers, which has a stringify method. This will take a JavaScript object or array and convert it into valid JSON format. It's a convenience feature built into the browser. Also has nothing to do with React. So here, I want to pass that ingredient we're getting. Basically, ingredient like this without an ID, because now Firebase will generate an ID for us, so we don't have to do that manually. Now, one other thing you also need to set now is headers. This allows us to set our own headers, and that in turn is a JavaScript object, a nested JavaScript object. And there you can set headers you want to append to this request, and there Firebase expects the content type header and set this to application JSON. With Axios, we didn't have to do that because Axios did it for us. Fetch doesn't do it for us, just as it doesn't convert data to JSON for us. So we have to do the data conversion manually. We have to add this header manually to inform Firebase that we got some incoming JSON data. And fetch will now return a promise, which will eventually resolve once this request successfully was sent. Or of course, once it fails. That could be an option too. Now, let's say we want to update our data locally when this promise is done. Then we can use then here and get the response inside of this nested function. And in there, I then want to update my ingredients. Because as you learned throughout this course, with promises, the thing is that the function you're passing to then will not execute immediately when this gets executed, but only when this request is done in this case. So then I want to update my ingredient. You could also use async await here if you wanted to, of course, but I will stick to this then approach because I think it makes it really clear that this executes at a later point of time. Now, the good thing is here, by the way, this response actually will get some data back from Firebase, which contains that automatically generated ID. Response itself, however, is a more complex object. We're interested in the body of that response, and you get that by calling the JSON method there. This will extract the body and convert it from JSON to normal JavaScript code. However, this also returns a promise, so we'll actually return response JSON here and move this code into another then block, which I change here, which will be my body or my response data. I get this in this function here, which I pass to the second then block, which executes once this body has been parsed. And now response data will be an object which has a name property which contains this automatically generated ID. That's just how Firebase works. So here we can now set ID equal to response data.name. Again, that we can access .name here has nothing to do with React or with the fetch API. That's just Firebase. It returns some data, which in the end is a JavaScript object, which has a name property, and that name property will have that unique ID which was generated by Firebase. If you're using a different API, this will probably not be named, but for Firebase it is. And now we're creating our ingredient locally, and we're updating it there based on our previous ingredients with that ingredient we got here and with our name, with our ID generated by Firebase. So let's see whether that works. Let's save that. Let's go back to our application. Let's add 5 apples. And you see it takes a while until it appears here, which makes sense because we're sending a HTTP request. And then here we indeed have ingredients added, and this is this unique ID. And if I add bananas, 10, again, it takes a while, not that long because Firebase is very quick, but a short while. And we also see it here. So that's working. As soon as we reload, though, all data is lost. So the next goal is to fetch our data whenever we reload. So whenever our app starts or whenever ingredients gets rendered, so to say. And for that, we normally would have used lifecycle methods. We would have used component did mount. And we can't use that anymore here, unless we transform this to a class-based component, of course, which is not the goal. But React hooks got us covered.